Why would someone who has power over death allow tears to stream down their face? Have you ever stopped to think about that calmly? Imagine the scene. A tomb sealed by a large stone, the smell of death in the air, people crying, voices choked with emotion, hearts broken by loss. And there, right in the center of this scene of pain, is Jesus. He didn't arrive late by chance. He knows exactly what will happen. He knows that, in a few moments, Lazarus will return to life. And yet, Jesus cries. Why? Perhaps you've experienced moments when everything seemed meaningless, even while believing that God was in control of the situation. Have you ever been through that? The feeling of trusting, but at the same time feeling the weight of pain tightening your chest? It is precisely here that this biblical scene disconcerts and captivates us. Because Jesus weeping before Lazarus' tomb is not just any detail. It is a gesture full of humanity, compassion, and spiritual depth. The Gospel of John presents us with one of the shortest verses in the Bible, but also one of the most impactful. Jesus wept. Just 2 words. No lengthy explanation, no theological discourse, no justification. Only tears. And perhaps that is precisely what makes this moment so powerful. Jesus does not observe human suffering from a distance. He approaches. He feels. He allows himself to be touched by the pain of others. While Martha and Mary mourn the loss of their brother, while friends and acquaintances struggle to cope with the silence of death, Jesus does not hastily interrupt their grief. He does not immediately say that everything will be all right. He does not reveal the miracle prematurely. He weeps along with them, and this simple, almost silent gesture reveals something that many people ignore when they read this text hastily. What you are about to discover may surprise you, because this weeping is not a sign of weakness, nor of doubt, nor of lack of faith. On the contrary, it reveals a profoundly human Jesus, who understands pain not only as God, but as someone who has lived through real emotions. A Jesus who does not treat suffering as a problem to be solved quickly, but as an experience that needs to be felt and respected. Perhaps that's why this scene transcends centuries and continues to touch hearts to this day. Because, in some way, we have all stood before graves in our own lives. Buried dreams, irreparable losses, expectations that died too soon. And, in those moments, the silent question arises. If God can do something, why does he allow pain to exist? Stay with me until the end, because this question is at the heart of this story, and the answer is neither simple nor superficial. Jesus weeping forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Faith does not negate tears. Trusting in God does not mean ignoring pain. And perhaps that is precisely what makes this episode so profoundly human and spiritual at the same time. Jesus does not weep because he has lost control of the situation. He weeps because he loves, because he cares, because he is present. While many expected an immediate display of power, Jesus offers something even rarer, empathy. And before any visible miracle, he reveals something invisible yet essential, the heart of God in the face of human suffering. This seemingly simple moment carries hidden teachings that go unnoticed by many. And that's precisely where we need to slow down and look more closely at this scene. Because before the stone is removed, before the voice that calls Lazarus out of the tomb, there is a heavy silence, and tears that speak much louder than words. It is at this point in the story that everything begins to make sense. And that is exactly what we will explore next. And perhaps that's precisely why this scene continues to resonate so strongly within us. Because, somehow, it touches places we can't always explain in words. As we watch Jesus weeping before Lazarus' tomb, we are not merely witnessing a biblical episode distant in time, but a silent mirror of our own pain, losses, and unanswered questions. Each tear there seems to carry stories that are also ours. If this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far. Perhaps a loss you still carry, a question you never dared to ask, or even an experience where you felt God was present even in silence. When you comment, you're not talking alone. Other viewers may also identify with your story, and this creates something precious, a welcoming space where faith and humanity walk hand in hand. And if this reflection has already touched you in some way, liking this video is a simple yet powerful way to show that this kind of content matters. Each like helps this message reach more people who may be experiencing pain, doubt, or waiting right now. People who need to know that Jesus doesn't ignore tears, that he draws near, feels them, and stays. Subscribing to the channel is also a gesture of walking together. It's like saying, I want to continue reflecting on these gestures, silences, and attitudes of Jesus that so often go unnoticed. Your presence here strengthens this channel and allows more content like this to continue being produced, always with depth, sensitivity, and respect for the Word. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people with this type of content, forming a community that is not afraid to talk about pain, faith, and hope at the same time. And as we continue together, it's worth remembering that this story is not yet over. Before the miracle, there is a silence full of meaning. Before the resurrection, there are tears that teach. And it is precisely at this point that we need to continue looking carefully to understand what this weeping of Jesus still has to reveal to us. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because it is precisely here that many rush past and end up missing one of the most intense revelations in the entire gospel. John writes only 2 words, Jesus wept, nothing more. No detailed description, no adjectives, no attempt to explain what was happening in Christ's mind at that moment. It's as if the biblical text compels us to stop, breathe, and face the scene unfiltered. The simplicity does not impoverish the message. On the contrary, it makes it almost impossible to ignore. This is the shortest verse in the Bible, but perhaps one of the most challenging to our religious mindset. Because we are used to seeking quick explanations, ready-made answers, formulas that alleviate discomfort. But there is none of that here. There is silence. There are tears. There is an exposure of pain. The gospel does not try to soften the impact of that moment. It does not transform suffering into something symbolic or abstract. It shows a real Jesus, visibly emotional, affected by the grief around him. And that changes everything. Because if Jesus cries, then human suffering is not irrelevant to God. It is not a minor detail within a larger plan. It is taken seriously. This crying is not staged. It is not didactic in a superficial sense. It comes from within. It is human. It is concrete. It is the kind of tear that needs no translation. And perhaps that is precisely why this verse has traversed centuries with such impact. It reveals a hidden truth that confronts our way of seeing faith, strength, and spirituality. Many imagine that true spirituality is the absence of emotion, absolute control, distance from suffering. But the text shows us the opposite. Jesus does not protect himself emotionally. He does not create a barrier between himself and people's pain. He enters the scene completely. This reveals a profound transformation in the way we understand God. Not as someone distant, observing the human journey from above, but as someone who walks within it, feeling each step. There's something behind this verse that's rarely explored. Jesus doesn't weep out of ignorance of what will come next. He doesn't weep because he has lost hope. He weeps knowing exactly how the story ends. And this leads us to an uncomfortable, but necessary, reflection. Perhaps the weeping isn't only linked to Lazarus' death, but to the human condition as a whole. To the pain that insists on existing, to separation, to fragility, to that which was never part of the original plan, but has become part of our reality. This moment reveals that knowing the end of the story doesn't eliminate the weight of the journey there. How many times in our own journey do we know that something will pass, that a difficult phase will end, that an answer will come, and yet it still hurts, still tires us, still makes us cry? Jesus' tears legitimize these experiences. He shows us that feeling is not failing, that tears don't negate faith, that emotion is not the enemy of truth. John could have chosen to highlight the miracle immediately. He could have accelerated the pace of the narrative. But he stops here. He chooses to record this detail. And this is no accident. This verse functions as a crack through which we can see the heart of Christ. A heart that allows itself to be affected, that is moved, that does not treat people as numbers or situations as obstacles to be resolved quickly. There is a silent impact in all of this, because this crying confronts internal decisions that many of us make throughout life. The decision to harden, to not feel so much, to move on without looking back. Jesus takes the opposite path. He stops, he feels, he cries, and in doing so, he redefines what strength means. Perhaps strength is not the absence of tears, but the courage not to hide them. This verse also invites us to revise our mindset about God. A God who weeps is not a distant God. A God who weeps does not minimize losses. A God who weeps cares about names, stories, bonds, affections. Lazarus is not just someone who died. He is a friend, and friendship creates bonds. Bonds create pain when there is separation. The gospel does not try to hide this. It exposes it. And when we realize this, something begins to stir within us. Because we understand that our tears are also part of the journey. That they don't need to be hidden in the name of a faith that pretends to always be okay. There is a powerful revelation here, almost silent, but transformative. God doesn't expect you to be invulnerable. He draws near precisely when you are not. This cry is small in words, but gigantic in meaning. It prepares us to understand everything that comes after. Because before any demonstration of power, there is a demonstration of love. Before the voice that calls Lazarus forth, there is the heavy silence of one who feels the weight of death. And it is impossible to understand the miracle without first going through this moment attentively. All of this leads us to look at this scene more carefully, with more respect, with more depth. Because the more we observe, the more we realize that nothing here is too simple to be ignored. Something is being revealed little by little, layer by layer, and there is still much to be unveiled as we continue to move forward in this text with an open heart. If all of this makes sense to you, leave a comment below with just one sentence. This makes sense to me. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because this is where the scene ceases to be merely a biblical account and begins to directly touch our own journey. When John records that Jesus wept, he is not just showing emotion. He is revealing humanity in its rawest and most honest form. A God who feels pain not from a distance, not as a spectator, but as someone who is inside the story, breathing the same heavy air, feeling the same tightness in his chest, hearing the same lamentations around the tomb. This shatters an image that many carry, sometimes without realizing it, the idea of a cold, unreachable God, immune to human suffering. A God who only observes, calculates, decides, and executes. Jesus' tears dismantle this mentality. He doesn't arrive as someone emotionally shielded. He arrives as someone who allows himself to be pierced by the pain of others. And this completely changes how we understand who he is. Jesus doesn't see Martha and Mary as characters in a story he controls from above. He sees them as real people with real bonds, with a real loss. He knows friendship, he knows affection, he knows the void left by absence. This involvement reveals a hidden truth that transforms our spiritual perception. God doesn't just approach to resolve situations. He approaches to walk alongside us in suffering. There is a profound impact in this because we often learn throughout life to distance ourselves from pain as a defense mechanism. We harden ourselves. We create masks. We make internal decisions not to feel so much. Jesus does the exact opposite. He allows himself to feel. He doesn't run away from emotion. He doesn't try to rationalize the pain in that moment. He cries. And this simple gesture redefines what strength, maturity, and even faith mean. The full humanity of Jesus does not diminish his divinity. It reveals it in an even more powerful way. Because a God who feels pain understands pain. A God who cries understands tears. A God who gets involved does not treat human suffering as something small or irrelevant. He validates the human experience without needing long speeches or complex explanations. Sometimes, presence is the message. This creates a direct connection with the viewer, because we all know pain from our own experience. Not as a concept, but as lived experience. We have all faced situations where there weren't enough words. Moments when advice sounded empty, ready-made phrases didn't help, and all that existed was a heavy silence. Jesus enters precisely into this space. He doesn't try to fill the silence hastily. He remains. This weeping also reveals something about the internal choices we make along our journey. Many people believe that feeling too much is a sign of weakness, that showing pain is losing control, that crying is a lack of faith. But Christ weeping before a friend's tomb dismantles this logic. He shows that feeling is not losing authority, and that emotion does not negate purpose. There's something behind the scenes of this moment that's rarely mentioned. Jesus could have avoided this pain. He could have arrived sooner. He could have done things differently. But he enters this specific scenario at this specific time, knowing that it would involve tears. This leads us to reflect on how, Often, certain painful experiences are part of a larger process of transformation, both individual and collective. Not because pain is good, but because it reveals truths that don't emerge in superficial environments. Jesus' tears also teach us about true empathy. Not that distant empathy that observes from afar and offers generic words, but the empathy that draws near, that feels together, that shares the weight of the moment. This completely changes how we look at the suffering of others. If Christ himself did not ignore the pain of others, why do we so often try to gloss over it quickly? There is a silent revelation here about relationships. Jesus is not just the powerful Messiah, he is the friend who cares. Lazarus is not just any name in the narrative. He represents bonds, history, shared experiences. The pain of loss is not abstract. It is personal. And Jesus enters this personal space without reservation. This brings God closer to human reality in a way that few texts manage to do. When we realize this, something begins to change within us. Our mindset about God expands. Our understanding of faith deepens. We understand that trusting in God doesn't mean numbing feelings, but going through emotions with Him. That spirituality is not the denial of pain, but the courage to face it together. This moment also sheds light on our own emotional choices. How many times do we choose not to feel in order to survive? How many times do we suppress tears to appear strong? Jesus weeping invites us to reconsider these internal choices. Perhaps there is more healing in feeling than in pretending that nothing hurts. Perhaps there is more transformation in allowing oneself to be human than in trying to be invulnerable. And the more we look at this scene, the more we realize it's not an isolated detail. It sets the stage for everything that comes after. Before power, there is compassion. Before action, there is presence. Before life returns, there are tears that fall. None of this is random. Everything carries meaning, impact, and direction. This revealed humanity does not weaken the message of the gospel. It makes it even closer. Because a God who feels pain is a God who understands yours. A God who cries is a God who does not leave when everything seems dark. And this understanding changes the way we continue on this journey of faith, step by step, decision after decision, even when not everything makes sense. There is still much to be observed in this encounter between tears and hope, between pain and purpose. Because the closer we get to this human Jesus, the more prepared we become to understand what his next actions truly mean. If you can relate to this, write in the comments, "I'm on this journey too." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because here we touch on one of the most transformative principles of this entire narrative. Jesus doesn't rush to perform miracles. This, in itself, confronts many things within us. We live in a fast-paced mentality, where everything needs to be resolved quickly, where problems exist to be eliminated as soon as possible, where pain is seen as an obstacle on the path to a solution. But before Lazarus' tomb, Jesus does something unexpected. He doesn't ignore suffering to demonstrate power. He doesn't skip over pain to reach a result. He pauses. He is moved. He feels. Before any supernatural demonstration, there is empathy. Before the command that conquers death, there is compassion. This reveals a hidden truth that completely changes how we see God and, at the same time, how we deal with people. Jesus doesn't treat that scene as a challenge to be solved, but as lives to be cared for. Martha, Mary, the friends, the collective grief, none of that is a disposable backdrop to the miracle. All of that matters. This attitude reveals much about spiritual priorities. Because if it were only about power, the crying wouldn't make sense. If it were only about authority, the delay wouldn't make sense. But the gospel shows us that, for Jesus, people come before results. Relationships come before solutions. Presence comes before action. This is deeply counterintuitive to our logic, but extremely consistent with the heart of God. How many times in our own journey do we want God to solve things quickly, change things quickly, intervene quickly, without realizing that something is being worked on before that? Something internal, something invisible, something that involves a transformation of mindset, emotional maturity, silent decisions that only arise when we are touched by compassion. Jesus doesn't ignore pain because it's part of the process. He enters into it because he knows that the miracle, when it comes, needs to find whole people, not just resolve situations. This detail changes everything. because it shows that God doesn't see us as problems to be fixed, but as stories to be loved. He doesn't only approach us when there's something to fix, but when someone is suffering. And this creates a profound impact on how we understand faith. Faith isn't just believing that something will change. It's trusting that, even before the change, there is care. Behind the scenes of this miracle, a relationship is being reaffirmed. Jesus allows himself to feel the pain of that environment because he values the people who are there. This reveals a pattern that repeats itself throughout the Gospels. He touches before healing, he looks before speaking, he approaches before acting. Compassion is never a secondary detail. It is the starting point. This also confronts us personally, because often when we see someone suffering, we want to offer quick answers, ready-made solutions, phrases that alleviate the discomfort. Jesus teaches us another way. He shows us that being present, feeling with them, and respecting the time of pain is, in itself, a powerful act. Sometimes the greatest need is not for an answer but for someone to stay. This sequence, compassion before the miracle, reveals something essential about God's character. He doesn't use people as a stage for displays of power. He doesn't exploit the pain of others to prove a point. He honors pain before transforming it. And this completely changes how we perceive divine action in our own lives. Perhaps that's why this miracle is so remarkable. Not just because a man is resurrected, but because, before that, we see a God who cares. A God who doesn't treat tears as a setback, but as a legitimate part of the journey. A God who understands that the miracle doesn't begin when the stone is removed, but when the heart is reached. This understanding changes our daily decisions. It changes how we deal with others. It changes how we deal with ourselves. Because we come to understand that we don't need to rush internal processes to prove strength. That we don't need to hide pain to demonstrate faith. That we don't need to solve everything immediately to be spiritually mature. The miracle comes later, yes, but it comes after something even deeper, the validation of human suffering. Jesus teaches, without words, that loving comes before acting. That feeling comes before transforming. That caring comes before changing circumstances. And when we understand this, our relationship with God ceases to be merely functional and becomes relational. The more we look at this scene, the more we realize that nothing there is accidental. Each pause, each tear, each gesture prepares the ground for something greater. There is a silent construction taking place, an alignment between the human heart and the divine heart, which makes the miracle not only possible, but meaningful. And it is precisely at this point that we need to continue moving forward with care, because when we understand why Jesus did not rush to perform the miracle, we begin to understand more clearly what his subsequent actions truly reveal. If this resonates with you, comment below, "This makes sense to me." Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because after compassion comes something that often goes unnoticed, but carries enormous weight, the silence of Jesus. A silence that is not empty, not absent, not indifferent. It is a silence laden with meaning. Standing before Lazarus' tomb, Jesus doesn't deliver a sermon. He doesn't offer a theological explanation for the pain. He doesn't try to organize the emotional chaos with beautiful words. He is simply there, and often that speaks louder than any discourse. We are used to associating God with speech, with order, with the creative word. But here, the gospel shows us a Christ who teaches in silence. A Christ who allows silence to exist without trying to fill it quickly. This confronts our modern mentality, which has difficulty dealing with pauses, with waiting, with moments without an immediate answer. We want to understand everything, explain everything, solve everything. Jesus, at that moment, does none of that. What he doesn't say is as important as what he does. He doesn't say, "Don't cry." He doesn't say, "Everything will be all right in that moment." He doesn't say, "You still don't understand who I am?" He doesn't fix the pain. He doesn't spiritualize suffering to make it more acceptable. He respects the weight of that moment. And this respect reveals a profound hidden truth. Not all pain needs immediate explanation. Some only need to be embraced. Jesus' silence teaches us that there are times when words hinder more than they help. There are times when the human heart cannot receive answers, but can perceive presence. And Jesus chooses presence. He chooses the silent gesture. He chooses tears. This reveals a kind of wisdom that goes beyond traditional religious logic, a wisdom that understands the other person's timing. This silence also teaches us something about spiritual maturity. Not everything needs to be said. Not every truth needs to be proclaimed in the midst of pain. There are revelations that only make sense after the heart goes through the process. Jesus knows this. He doesn't anticipate the miracle with words. He doesn't break the impact of what is to come with premature explanations. He allows that moment to be exactly what it is. This changes how we understand spiritual communication, because we often believe that teaching is about speaking, explaining, arguing. But Jesus teaches with what he doesn't say. He teaches with the space he creates. He teaches with the silence that accompanies suffering. This kind of teaching doesn't enter through the mind first, it enters through the heart. And the impact of that is much deeper and more lasting. Behind the scenes of this scene, a divine lesson is taking place. Jesus is showing that God is not anxious, that he is not in a hurry to justify his ways, that he doesn't need to prove anything at that moment. He trusts the process. He trusts that silence also communicates. And this reveals something powerful about our own journey. We won't always understand everything in the midst of pain, and that's okay. Jesus' silence also invites us to reconsider our decisions when faced with the suffering of others. How often do we talk too much because we don't know how to deal with the discomfort of others? How often do we offer quick answers because silence bothers us? Jesus shows us another way, a way where respect for the time of mourning is more important than the need to say something. There is a subtle transformation that happens when we realize this. We come to understand that faith is not about always having something to say, but about knowing when to remain silent. That spirituality is not about filling all the voids with words, but about recognizing that some voids are part of the healing process. Jesus' silence validates the pain without trying to control it. This silent gesture also deepens our understanding of God's character. A God who is silent is not an absent God. On the contrary, he is so present that he doesn't need to speak to be perceived. He communicates through his gaze, his posture, and shared emotion. This creates a much more intimate connection with human experience. When we look at this scene closely, we realize that the silence is not an interval between two important actions. It is, in itself, an action, an act of love, conscious gesture. Jesus chooses not to speak because he understands that that moment calls for something different. And this reveals a divine sensitivity that we rarely associate with the idea of power. This silence prepares the emotional ground for everything that comes after. It organizes the heart before organizing the situation. It creates inner space before external change. It honors the process before the result. Nothing there is rushed, nothing is artificial. Everything happens at the right time with the right weight. And perhaps this is one of the most profound revelations of this scene. God also speaks when he is silent. He also teaches when he doesn't explain. He also guides when he seems only to remain. This kind of silence doesn't create emptiness. It creates expectation. It doesn't end the story. It deepens its meaning. The more we reflect on what Jesus didn't say at that moment, the more we realize there's a hidden teaching there, waiting to be perceived by those willing to listen beyond the words. Because before the voice that commands life, there is a silence that prepares the heart to receive it. If this reflection resonated with you, comment below. I'm on this journey too. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because everything we've seen so far naturally leads us to a very practical, very current, and extremely personal question. What does Jesus weeping teach us about faith today, in the midst of our reality, our daily decisions, and the pain we carry in silence? This episode isn't there merely to move us or impress us with a sensitive detail of Christ's life. It's there to redefine how we understand faith, spiritual strength, and our relationship with God. There is a widespread mentality, often even within religious circles, that true faith is synonymous with absolute emotional control, as if trusting in God meant never wavering, never crying, never showing weakness. But Jesus' tears dismantle this logic silently and profoundly. He shows us that faith is not emotional anesthesia. Faith is not denying what hurts. Faith is going through pain without walking alone. Jesus doesn't cry despite faith. He cries within faith. Tears are not a deviation from purpose, but part of the journey. This is a revelation that transforms our relationship with God because it frees us from the need to appear strong all the time. It frees us from the guilt of feeling. It frees us from the idea that showing pain is a sign of spiritual failure. Christ himself, fully trusting in the Father, allows suffering to be expressed. This detail completely changes how we deal with our own crises. Because when we understand this, we realize that crying doesn't mean giving up. It means feeling. It means loving. It means recognizing that something matters. Jesus cries because Lazarus matters, because Martha and Mary matter, because human pain matters. And, if it matters to him, it can also be presented to God without fear, without filters, without masks. The faith that emerges from this episode is not a superficial faith, based solely on quick results or immediate answers. It is a mature faith, one that endures the weight of waiting, that coexists with silence, that remains even when the situation has not yet changed. It is a faith that does not demand emotional shortcuts. A faith that understands that hope and tears can coexist in the same heart. This has a direct impact on our personal journey. How many times do we try to skip internal steps? How many times do we want to get to the solution quickly without going through the process? Jesus shows us that the process matters, that transformation is happening while we are still crying, that internal decisions are shaped in these moments of vulnerability, that something profound is being built when we allow God to accompany us in pain, and not just after it. Jesus' tears also teach us that trust is not the absence of questions. He doesn't cry because he has lost hope, but because he is involved. And this reveals a powerful hidden truth. Trusting in God doesn't mean understanding everything, but remaining present even without understanding. Continuing to walk even when the heart is heavy. Continuing to believe even when the eyes are filled with tears. This episode helps us to reframe our own tears. They cease to be seen as enemies of faith and become part of human language before God. A language that needs no translation because he understands it perfectly. Jesus not only accepts tears, he lives them. He legitimizes this path. He shows that there is room for pain within hope. And it is precisely there that we begin to perceive something even greater being prepared. Because the weeping is not the end of the story. It does not conclude the episode. Precedes something extraordinary. There is a profound connection between these tears and what is about to happen. Before the voice that calls Lazarus forth, there is a heart that feels the weight of death. Before the return of life, there is empathy. Before the visible resurrection, there is a deep identification with human frailty. This teaches us that God doesn't take us directly from pain to victory without going through the middle of the journey. He walks with us. He walks beside us. He senses before acting. And when he acts, he does so from a place of love, not distance. The power that comes afterward doesn't erase the tears that came before. It honors them. This understanding changes how we face our own losses, expectations, and frustrations. Because we come to understand that the time for tears is not wasted time. It is a time for inner building. It is a time for alignment. It is a time for preparation. Something is being organized within us while we are still in the dark, while we do not yet see the outcome. Jesus' tears invite us to a more honest, more human, deeper faith. A faith that doesn't need to constantly perform a show of strength. A faith that knows God doesn't turn away when we cry, but draws near. A faith that understands that hope isn't about denying reality, but trusting that it doesn't end there. And when we look at this scene closely, we realize that these tears are not a sign of defeat, but a harbinger of something greater. They create tension, expectation, depth. They prepare us emotionally to understand the weight of what is about to be revealed. Because when life triumphs over death, when the voice breaks the silence of the tomb, we understand that that power is born from a love that was already present before. This connection between tears and resurrection teaches us that God does not waste pain, that he does not ignore suffering, that he transforms. And often, transformation begins precisely at the point where we think all is lost. If this resonates with your story, comment below, "This makes sense to me." If you've made it this far, it's because this conversation has found a place within you. And that, to me, says a lot. Content like this isn't meant to be consumed in a hurry, but to accompany us on our journey, in moments when questions arise and the heart needs more depth than quick answers. If you feel that this type of reflection helps you see faith in a more honest, more human, and more real way, subscribing to the channel is a simple way to continue this journey with me, step by step, exploring these gestures, silences, and truths that often go unnoticed. If you'd like, leave a comment saying you made it to the end, writing something like, "This message was for me." It's not just about showing up, it's about recording this moment, this connection, this exchange that happens here. And if this conversation created a connection with you, leaving a like is a simple way to signal that it helps the video reach other people who might need exactly that same message right now. And before you leave, take a look at the video that's appearing over here. It complements everything we've been reflecting on today very well. Click there and continue with me.